When my neighbor Marcus spat in my face at his daughter's funeral and screamed "baby killer" in front of everyone, I thought my life was over. My career, my dignity, everything was buried right there beside that grave. But when the police opened the security camera footage from outside the hospital for the investigation, the air in the room turned to ice. Marcus's knees buckled, and he collapsed right where he stood. Because those recordings didn't show a nurse's mistake. They showed a father's secret so dark it will freeze your blood. What I saw in that room that day is something you will never forget. Before we reveal the shocking truth hidden in those tapes, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you believe justice should always be served. Now let's go back to that terrifying night. My name is Taylor Morgan. I'm a nurse at a private hospital in Atlanta, and I used to be in love with my job, or at least, I was until that night. I'm known for being disciplined. I don't let my hands shake. I can't. Years ago, I lost my own little brother in a tragic accident, and I made a promise to myself in that cold hospital hallway. I will never let another person's sibling, another person's child slip through my hands. That oath was the only thing keeping me upright until that Tuesday night. My shift was quiet. Then the radio crackled. 8-year-old female respiratory failure and severe trauma, ETA 2 minutes. When the doors flew open, I recognized the face on the stretcher immediately. It was Lily Anderson, my next-door neighbor, Marcus's daughter. Her blonde hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat. Her lips were blue. Seeing her like that felt like a knife in my heart, but I had to stay professional. "We need to intubate immediately," I yelled. Doctors swarmed around us. Lily's tiny body was trembling on that thin line between life and death. I followed every protocol, every medication, every intervention down to the second. I fought for her like it was my own brother lying there. But sometimes, no matter how hard you fight, you cannot beat fate. When that high-pitched flat sound from the monitor filled my ears, it was 3:42 a.m. We had lost Lily. I still had the defibrillator pads in my hands when the ER doors burst open. It was Marcus. He looked disheveled, his eyes bloodshot. Before the doctor could even say, "I'm sorry for your loss," Marcus's eyes locked onto me. In that moment, I didn't see grief. I saw pure, unadulterated hatred. He charged at me. Before security could react, he grabbed me by my scrubs. "You!" he roared, his voice loud enough to freeze the blood of every patient in the corridor. "She died because of you. You killed her. You did something wrong. I know it." "Marcus, please." I tried to speak, my voice trembling. "I did everything I could." "You're a liar," he screamed, shoving me hard against the medicine cabinet. "She was in your hands. You killed my healthy child." "I will destroy you, Taylor. I'll have your license revoked. I'll see you rot in prison." The whole hospital staff, the patients, everyone was staring. Marcus's accusations didn't sound like just a grieving father's delirium. He was so sure of himself that for a split second, I saw that terrible doubt in my own colleague's eyes. Did Taylor actually make a mistake? That night, when I locked myself in the locker room, I cried not just for Lily, but for my own life. But I didn't know that Marcus's attack was just the beginning. The real nightmare would start when the camera footage was revealed. The next morning, I walked into the hospital feeling like I was walking into my own execution. And honestly, that's exactly what it felt like, because every pair of eyes that landed on me carried a question mark that burned straight through my skin. The whispers started before I even reached the nurse's station, and I could hear fragments of conversations that people weren't even trying to hide anymore. "Did you hear what happened with Taylor last night?" One of the younger nurses murmured to her colleague near the supply closet, and her friend responded with that knowing look that made my stomach turn. "Marcus Anderson is saying she killed his daughter. And you know what? I heard she's been working double shifts lately. Maybe she was too exhausted to think straight." I wanted to scream at them that I had done everything right, that Lily's death wasn't my fault, but my voice felt trapped somewhere deep in my throat, like it was buried under a mountain of shame I didn't deserve. Sarah Mitchell, one of my closest friends at the hospital and someone I'd worked alongside for 6 years, approached me cautiously near the medication room, and I could see the conflict written all over her face. "Taylor, I need to ask you something," she started, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, and I already knew what was coming. "Did you follow protocol exactly? Because Marcus is telling everyone that you made a critical error, and some people are starting to wonder if maybe in the chaos of the moment something got missed." The fact that even Sarah, someone who knew how meticulous I was about my work, could question me felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than Marcus's accusations. "Sarah, I did everything by the book," I told her, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the counter. "Every single intervention was documented. Every medication was double-checked. I fought for that little girl like she was my own flesh and blood." But I could see the doubt lingering in her eyes, and that's when I realized that no matter what I said, Marcus had already planted seeds of suspicion that were growing like poison ivy through every corridor of this hospital. By noon, the hospital administration called an emergency meeting, and I was summoned to the conference room on the 3rd floor where Dr. Patricia Hendricks, our chief of staff, sat at the head of the table with her, hands folded and her expression unreadable. "Taylor, you understand why we're here," she began, her tone carefully neutral in that way administrators use when they're trying not to commit to either side of a story. "Mr. Anderson has filed a formal complaint alleging medical negligence in his daughter's death, and while we have no reason to believe you acted improperly, we need to conduct a thorough internal investigation." The words medical negligence hit me like a physical blow, and I felt my professional reputation, everything I'd worked so hard to build over the past 8 years, crumbling right there in that sterile conference room. "I want to cooperate fully with any investigation," I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange and distant to my own ears. "I have nothing to hide, and I know I did everything possible to save Lily." Dr. Hendricks nodded slowly, but then she said something that made my blood run cold. "Taylor, I'm going to have to place you on administrative leave pending the outcome of this investigation, and I need you to understand that this is standard procedure in cases like this, not an indication of guilt." Administrative leave. Those 2 words that might as well have been a scarlet letter branded across my chest for everyone to see. "You're suspending me?" I asked, unable to keep the shock out of my voice. "Dr. Hendricks, I've never had a single complaint against me in 8 years. My record is spotless." But she just gave me that same neutral expression and replied, "It's not a suspension, it's a precautionary measure. And frankly, Taylor, with the way Marcus Anderson is behaving, it's also for your own safety." When I left that conference room, I felt like I was walking through a nightmare where everything familiar had suddenly become hostile and strange. And as I packed up my locker later that afternoon, removing my stethoscope and the photos I'd taped inside the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being erased from this place that had been my second home. The drive back to my apartment in Midtown was a blur of tears and confusion. And when I finally pulled into my parking spot, I realized, with a sick feeling in my stomach, that Marcus lived exactly 3 doors down from me in the same building. We were neighbors, had been for almost 2 years, and I'd watched Lily grow from a shy 6-year-old into that bright, energetic 8-year-old who always waved at me in the hallway. How had everything gone so catastrophically wrong? That evening, I sat alone in my apartment staring at my phone as notifications started flooding in, because apparently Marcus hadn't been content with destroying my reputation at the hospital. He'd taken his crusade online, posting on every neighborhood Facebook group and community forum he could find. "The nurse who killed my daughter still walks free," one of his posts read, accompanied by a photo of Lily smiling in her school uniform. "Taylor Morgan worked at Peachtree Memorial Hospital, and because of her negligence, my beautiful baby girl is dead. Share this post. Make sure everyone knows what she did." The comment section was a feeding frenzy of outrage from people who didn't know me, had never met Lily, and had absolutely no idea what actually happened that night. "She should be in prison," one person wrote. "How is she still practicing medicine?" demanded another. Someone even posted my address, which sent a wave of genuine fear through my body. I reported the posts to Facebook, blocked Marcus on every platform I could think of, and then I did something I hadn't done since my brother died. I called my mother, and when she answered with that warm, "Hello, sweetheart," that always made me feel safe, I completely fell apart. "Mom, something terrible has happened," I sobbed into the phone, and for the next hour I poured out the whole horrific story while she listened with the kind of patient understanding only a mother can provide. "Taylor, listen to me very carefully," she said when I finally ran out of words. "The truth always comes out, always, and if you did everything right, then you have nothing to fear from any investigation." But her words, as comforting as they were meant to be, couldn't quiet the voice in my head that kept asking, what if they find a way to blame me anyway? What if Marcus's lies become the official story? Sleep was impossible that night, and I spent hours lying in the dark replaying every single moment of Lily's treatment in my mind like a video on loop. Had I missed something? Was there some tiny detail I'd overlooked in the chaos? I went through the entire sequence again and again, checking and rechecking my memory against the protocols I'd memorized years ago. Respiratory failure, immediate intubation, medications administered in proper sequence, chest compressions when her heart stopped, defibrillation attempts. Everything had been done exactly as it should have been. So why had Lily died? And more importantly, why was Marcus so absolutely certain that I was responsible? The next morning, I woke up to find that someone had spray-painted the word "killer" across my car in the parking garage, and I knew immediately who was behind it, even though I had no proof. My hands were shaking as I called the police to file a report, and the officer who responded, a tired-looking man in his 50s named Officer Rodriguez, took one look at the graffiti and sighed. "Ma'am, has anyone been threatening you recently?" he asked, while taking photos of the damage. I told him about Marcus, about the accusations and the social media posts, and he nodded with the weary recognition of someone who'd seen this kind of situation before. "I'll file a report, and we'll try to get your building's security footage, but unless we catch someone in the act or they confess, there's not much we can do about vandalism," he explained apologetically. "However, if you feel you're in physical danger, you should consider getting a restraining order." A restraining order against my grieving neighbor who'd just lost his daughter. That would certainly make me look sympathetic in the court of public opinion, I thought bitterly. But Officer Rodriguez must have seen something in my expression because he added, "Look, I understand this is a complicated situation, but your safety has to come first. And from what you're telling me, this man is escalating." He was right, of course, but the idea of taking legal action against Marcus felt like just another way I was being cast as the villain in a story where I should have been the hero. The investigation dragged on for 2 weeks that felt more like 2 years, and during that time, my entire life became a strange kind of suspended animation where I existed but didn't really live. I couldn't work, couldn't show my face at the hospital, couldn't even go to the grocery store without feeling like everyone was staring at me and judging me for something I didn't do. My savings account started dwindling because administrative leave meant reduced pay, and the lawyer I'd reluctantly hired after the vandalism incident cost more per hour than I made in half a day of nursing. His name was Richard Chen, a sharp-eyed attorney in his 40s who specialized in medical malpractice defense. And when I first sat down in his office and told him my story, he listened with an intensity that made me feel like maybe, just maybe, someone actually believed me. "Taylor, I'm going to be straight with you," Richard said after I'd finished explaining everything. "Cases like this can go one of 2 ways. Either the investigation clears you completely and life eventually returns to normal, or they find some tiny procedural error that technically violated protocol and you become the scapegoat for a tragedy that probably wasn't anyone's fault. His honesty was brutal, but I appreciated it more than false comfort would have provided. However, based on what you've told me, I don't think you did anything wrong. And more importantly, I think there's something Marcus Anderson isn't telling anyone about what happened before Lily got to that hospital. Those words sparked something in my mind, a question I'd been too traumatized to fully formulate until that moment. What had happened before Lily arrived at the emergency room? Marcus claimed she'd been healthy and fine until suddenly she wasn't. But respiratory failure and the kind of trauma the doctors noted in Lily's chart didn't just appear out of nowhere in a healthy child. I started doing my own investigation because sitting around waiting for other people to determine my fate was driving me insane, and I began by trying to remember everything I knew about Marcus and Lily from our time as neighbors. They'd moved into the building about 2 years ago, just Marcus and Lily. No mother in the picture, which I'd always found a bit odd but never questioned because plenty of single parents raise children successfully. Marcus worked in construction, something with commercial building projects, and he kept irregular hours that sometimes had him leaving at dawn and other times not coming home until late at night. Lily had always seemed like a sweet kid, maybe a little quieter than other children her age, and I remembered now that there were a few times I'd heard raised voices coming from their apartment, though I'd never actually witnessed anything concerning enough to report. I reached out to some of the other neighbors in our building, carefully framing my questions as concern about Lily rather than suspicion about Marcus, and what I learned made my stomach turn. Mrs. Chen from apartment 4B, an elderly woman who spent most of her time watching the comings and goings from her window, told me something disturbing when I knocked on her door with a plate of cookies as a conversation starter. "Oh, that poor little girl," she said, shaking her head sadly. "I saw her that day, the day she died. It was around 1 in the afternoon and she looked so pale and sick, barely able to walk, and her father was practically dragging her to his car." My pulse quickened at this information because Lily hadn't arrived at the hospital until after 3 in the morning, which meant there was a massive gap of time unaccounted for. "Mrs. Chen, are you absolutely sure about the time?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Oh yes, dear. I'm always sure about times because I watch my stories at 1 o'clock, and I was just settling in when I saw them." This revelation changed everything, and I immediately called Richard Chen to tell him what I'd learned. If Lily was visibly sick at 1 in the afternoon and didn't reach the hospital until 3 in the morning, we're talking about 14 hours of delay, Richard said, and I could hear the excitement in his voice that told me he sensed we were on to something crucial. That's not just negligence, Taylor, that could potentially be criminal neglect, and it would completely shift the narrative of what happened. He told me he'd hire a private investigator to dig deeper into Marcus's activities that day, and while I knew I should probably feel some sympathy for a grieving father, all I felt was a burning need to clear my name and expose whatever truth he was hiding. The private investigator's name was Diana Torres, a former police detective who'd gone into private practice and had the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that inspired confidence. She met with me at a coffee shop in Buckhead, far enough from my neighborhood that I didn't have to worry about running into anyone I knew, and she listened to everything I told her while taking meticulous notes in a worn leather notebook. "I'm going to need access to your hospital's security footage if possible," she said, "not just from the emergency room, but from the parking lot and surrounding areas, because if Marcus's story doesn't add up, the cameras will show it." I explained that I was on administrative leave and didn't have that kind of access, but Diana just smiled and said, "Don't worry, I have contacts who can help with that, and besides, if this becomes a police matter, which I suspect it will, those recordings will be subpoenaed anyway." While Diana worked her angles, I tried to piece together more information about Marcus from public records and social media, feeling slightly guilty about essentially stalking my neighbor but justifying it as self-preservation. What I found was troubling in ways I hadn't expected, because Marcus's social media presence painted a picture of a man whose life had been spiraling downward for months before Lily's death. His construction company had filed for bankruptcy 6 months earlier, according to public court records. He'd been posting increasingly erratic and angry rants on Facebook about the government and the economy and how the system was rigged against honest working men, and there were several posts suggesting he'd been drinking heavily. One post from 3 weeks before Lily died particularly stood out. A rambling midnight message that read, "Sometimes I wonder if everyone would be better off without me. This whole world is poison, and it's infecting everything it touches, even the innocent." At the time, people had responded with concerned comments asking if he was okay. But looking at it now, with the knowledge of what would happen, it read like a warning sign that everyone had missed. The day Diana called me with her preliminary findings, I was sitting in my apartment watching mindless television and trying not to think about how my entire career might be over before I turned 33. "Taylor, you need to sit down for this," Diana said, which was ironic since I was already sitting, but her tone made me brace myself anyway. I pulled Marcus Anderson's phone records for the day Lily died, and this is where it gets interesting. He made multiple calls to his ex-wife starting around 2 in the afternoon, and according to the cell tower data, he was nowhere near the hospital during any of those calls. My mind raced to process this information and its implications. His ex-wife? I didn't even know Lily had a mother in the picture, I admitted. "Oh, she's very much in the picture, or at least she was trying to be," Diana continued. "Her name is Rachel Anderson. She lives in Savannah, and according to the divorce records I found, she's been fighting Marcus for custody of Lily for the past year, claiming he's an unfit parent due to alcohol abuse and anger management issues. This new information reframed everything, and suddenly Marcus's desperate need to blame me for Lily's death made a different kind of sense. If he'd been drinking, if he'd delayed getting medical help for his daughter, if his negligence had contributed to her death, then of course he'd need a scapegoat to deflect attention from his own actions. "Diana, we need to talk to Rachel," I said urgently. "If she's been fighting for custody and documenting Marcus's problems, she might have information that could help prove what really happened." Diana agreed, but warned me that approaching Rachel had to be done carefully because she was likely devastated by her daughter's death and might not be receptive to questions from the nurse who'd been present when Lily died. "Let me make the initial contact," Diana suggested. "I'll explain the situation and see if she's willing to talk. But Taylor, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that what we find out might be even worse than we're imagining." 2 days later, Diana arranged a meeting with Rachel Anderson at a hotel near the airport, neutral territory where Rachel had agreed to meet after Diana explained that new information about Lily's death had come to light. I was nervous walking into that hotel lobby, not knowing what to expect from a woman who'd just lost her daughter and who probably associated me with that loss. But when Rachel stood up from the chair where she'd been waiting, I saw a woman who looked absolutely shattered, but also burning with a kind of quiet fury that I recognized from my own mirror. She was thin, probably in her late 30s, with Lily's same blonde hair and blue eyes, and when she looked at me, I saw both grief and something else, something that looked almost like relief that someone was finally asking the right questions. "Ms. Torres told me you're the nurse who tried to save my daughter," Rachel said after we'd all settled into a private meeting room the hotel had let us use. Her voice was controlled, but I could hear the tremor beneath it that spoke of barely contained emotion. "I want you to know that I never believed Marcus's accusations against you, not for 1 second, because I know exactly what kind of man he is, and I know that if Lily died, it's because he did something or failed to do something, not because a medical professional made a mistake." Her words released a pressure in my chest I hadn't realized I'd been carrying, and I felt tears spring to my eyes at finally hearing someone say, unequivocally, that they believed I'd done my best. "Rachel, I need to ask you some difficult questions about Marcus and about Lily," Diana began gently, and Rachel nodded like she'd been expecting this. "That day, the day Lily died, Marcus called you multiple times. Do you remember those conversations?" Rachel's expression darkened and she wrapped her arms around herself like she was trying to hold something broken inside. "He called me drunk at 2:30 in the afternoon, completely hysterical, saying that Lily was sick, and it was all my fault because I'd been stressing him out with the custody battle. He was slurring his words and barely making sense." She paused and took a shaky breath before continuing. "I told him to take Lily to the hospital immediately. I begged him. I even offered to call an ambulance myself, but he just kept screaming at me that he didn't need my help and that he could take care of his own daughter. Then he hung up on me." The room fell silent as the implications of this testimony settled over us like a heavy blanket, because what Rachel was describing was a father who'd put his pride and his anger above his daughter's welfare. "Rachel, did you try to call anyone else after that conversation?" I asked, needing to understand the full picture. "Did you call the police or an ambulance?" She nodded miserably and pulled out her phone, scrolling through her call log to show us. "I called 911 in Atlanta from Savannah. I told them I was worried about my daughter and gave them Marcus's address. But they said, unless I could confirm an actual emergency was in progress, they couldn't force entry into the home, and by the time I could have driven the 4 hours from Savannah to Atlanta, it was already too late." The guilt in her voice was palpable, and I found myself reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. Two women who'd both been powerless to save Lily united in our grief and our anger at the man who'd failed her most. "There's more you need to know about Marcus," Rachel said after composing herself. "The drinking got really bad about a year ago. Around the same time, his business started failing, and there were incidents with Lily that made me fear for her safety, which is why I filed for emergency custody." She pulled out a folder from her bag, the kind of documentation that spoke of a mother who'd been meticulously building a case. Inside were medical records, school reports, and photographs that made my stomach turn. 3 months ago, Lily showed up to school with bruises on her arms. The school nurse documented it and called CPS, but Marcus convinced the investigator that Lily had just fallen off her bike. The photos showed distinct finger mark bruises that looked nothing like a biking accident. 2 months ago, Lily told her teacher she was scared to go home because Daddy gets angry when he drinks, but again, Marcus talked his way out of it, claimed Lily was just acting out because of the divorce. The evidence Rachel was presenting painted a picture so dark and disturbing that I felt physically ill. And suddenly, Lily's death wasn't just a medical tragedy, but potentially something far more sinister. Diana was photographing every document with her phone, building a case that was becoming stronger by the minute, and I could see the determination in her eyes that told me she wasn't going to let Marcus get away with whatever he'd done. "Rachel, I know this is incredibly difficult, but we need to get this information to the police and to the hospital's investigation committee," Diana said firmly. "This changes everything about the narrative of what happened that night, and it proves that Taylor did nothing wrong while raising serious questions about Marcus's actions leading up to Lily's death." Rachel agreed immediately, saying she'd been waiting for someone to finally take her concerns seriously, and she gave us permission to use everything she'd brought as evidence in clearing my name. Armed with this new information, Richard Chen filed an emergency motion with the hospital's board demanding that they review Rachel's testimony and documentation before concluding their investigation of me, and he also contacted the police to suggest they open a criminal investigation into Marcus's conduct on the day of Lily's death. The wheels of justice move slowly, but once they start turning in the right direction, they can be unstoppable, and I felt for the first time in weeks like maybe I wasn't going to be destroyed by Marcus's lies after all. The hospital's attorney called Richard within hours of receiving our submission, and I could hear the concern in Richard's voice when he relayed their conversation to me. "Taylor, they're taking this very seriously, and they've agreed to expedite the review of the security footage from that night, not just the internal hospital cameras, but also the external parking lot surveillance and even traffic cameras from the surrounding area," he explained. "If Marcus's timeline doesn't match up with what he claimed, those cameras are going to prove it." The police were equally interested in what we'd uncovered, and Detective Marcus Okafor, a veteran investigator with the Atlanta Police Department's Crimes Against Children unit, reached out to me directly to discuss the case. We met at the police station downtown, a gray concrete building that smelled like stale coffee and institutional cleaning products, and Detective Okafor had the kind of steady, serious presence that made you feel like he'd heard every terrible story humanity had to offer, and still somehow maintained his faith in finding the truth. "Ms. Morgan, I want you to understand that we're treating this as a potential child endangerment case at minimum, and depending on what we find, the charges against Mr. Anderson could be significantly more severe," he told me while we sat in a windowless interview room. "I've reviewed the medical examiner's preliminary report on Lily Anderson's death, and there are some findings that raise questions about the timeline Marcus provided." Detective Okafor showed me parts of the medical examiner's report, carefully redacting certain details but showing me enough to understand why they were suspicious. Lily's blood toxicology showed elevated levels consistent with prolonged oxygen deprivation, and her core body temperature when she arrived at the hospital suggested she'd been in distress for many hours before receiving treatment, he explained, pointing to specific sections of the report. The bruising patterns the ME documented were also concerning. Some of them were fresh from that day, but others were in various stages of healing, suggesting repeated trauma over time. This medical evidence combined with Rachel's documentation and Mrs. Chen's eyewitness account was building an undeniable case that Marcus had endangered his daughter long before she ever reached my emergency room, and I felt a complex mixture of vindication and horror at what Lily must have suffered. "Detective, when will you be looking at the security footage?" I asked, because as much as this investigation was moving in the right direction, I needed concrete proof that would shut down Marcus's accusations once and for all. "We've already pulled footage from 6 different cameras covering the hospital and surrounding blocks," Detective Okafor replied. "We're reviewing it now, and I have to tell you, Ms. Morgan, what we're seeing is going to blow this case wide open." He paused, seeming to consider how much he should tell me, then continued. "I probably shouldn't share this before the formal investigation concludes, but I think you deserve to know that the cameras show Marcus's vehicle circling the hospital parking lot for over an hour before he finally brought Lily inside. And in some of the footage, we can clearly see him sitting in the parked car, and it doesn't look like he's attending to a sick child." The implications of what Detective Okafor was telling me were staggering, because if Marcus had Lily in his car for an hour outside the hospital while she was dying and he was just sitting there, then this wasn't negligence or poor judgment or panic. This was something approaching deliberate harm. "Why would he do that?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Detective Okafor's expression was grim when he responded. "In my experience, when a parent delays getting help for a critically ill child, it's usually because they're trying to figure out how to explain injuries they caused, or they're intoxicated and trying to sober up, or in the worst cases, they're actually hoping the child will die so they won't have to face the consequences of whatever they did." The casual way he said those horrifying words told me he'd seen this scenario play out before, probably more times than he cared to remember, and I felt a fresh wave of grief for Lily, who deserved so much better than the father she'd been given. The hospital board scheduled an emergency hearing for 3 days later, where they would review all the evidence that had come to light and make a final determination about my case, and Richard Chen prepared me extensively for what to expect. They're going to ask you to walk through everything that happened that night one more time, and they may challenge you on certain decisions you made. But Taylor, you need to stay calm and confident because the evidence is overwhelmingly in your favor now, he coached me the evening before the hearing. We sat in his office going over every possible question they might ask, and he made me practice my answers until they were clear and factual without being defensive. The key is to let the evidence speak for itself, Richard emphasized. Don't attack Marcus. Don't show anger even though you have every right to be angry. Just present the facts of what you did and let the board connect the dots about what Marcus didn't do. The morning of the hearing, I dressed in my most professional outfit, a navy blue suit that I'd bought for my brother's funeral years ago and hadn't worn since because it carried too many painful memories. But somehow it felt appropriate for this occasion that was about justice for another child lost too soon. My mother had driven up from Macon to be there for moral support, and having her sitting in the waiting area outside the hearing room gave me strength I hadn't known I needed. When they called me in, I walked into a large conference room where Dr. Patricia Hendricks sat at the center of a long table, flanked by 4 other board members, the hospital's chief legal counsel, and several administrators I recognized but didn't know personally. The atmosphere was formal and tense, and I could feel their eyes assessing me as I took my seat across from them with Richard at my side. Dr. Hendricks began by outlining the purpose of the hearing, explaining that they'd conducted a thorough review of my treatment of Lily Anderson and had also considered new evidence that had come to light regarding the circumstances preceding Lily's arrival at the hospital. Ms. Morgan, before we discuss our findings, we want to give you an opportunity to add anything to your previous statements about the events of that night, she said, her tone more gentle than it had been during our last meeting. I took a deep breath and told them everything again, walking through each step of Lily's treatment with the clarity that came from having relived those moments 1,000 times in my mind. I explained every medication, every intervention, every desperate attempt to save a child who'd been brought to us far too late, and I made sure they understood that I'd followed every protocol exactly as I'd been trained to do. When I finished, one of the board members, an older physician named Dr. Rothman, who I knew had a reputation for being particularly exacting, leaned forward and asked the question I'd been dreading. Ms. Morgan, in your professional opinion, if Lily Anderson had been brought to the hospital sooner, say immediately after her symptoms began, would the outcome have been different? It was a loaded question because answering yes would confirm that the delay had killed her, while answering no might seem like I was minimizing the severity of Marcus's actions. I chose my words carefully, drawing on the medical expertise I'd spent years developing. Dr. Rothman, based on the medical examiner's findings and the progression of symptoms described in the records, Lily was suffering from severe respiratory distress that had likely been developing for many hours, I explained. If she had received treatment when her symptoms first became apparent, her chances of survival would have been significantly higher. The human body can only tolerate oxygen deprivation for a limited time before irreversible damage occurs. And by the time Lily reached us, that window had largely closed. The room was silent for a moment after I spoke, and I could see the board members exchanging meaningful glances that suggested they'd already reached their conclusion before I'd even walked into this room. Dr. Hendricks cleared her throat and began speaking in a tone that carried the weight of official judgment. Ms. Morgan, this board has completed a comprehensive review of your treatment of Lily Anderson on the night of her death. We've examined every entry in her medical chart, reviewed testimony from every staff member who was present, and consulted with outside experts in emergency pediatric medicine, she stated formally. It is the unanimous finding of this board that you acted in accordance with all established protocols and standards of care, that your treatment was appropriate, aggressive, and compassionate, and that Lily Anderson's death was not the result of any action or inaction on your part. The relief that flooded through me at hearing those words was so intense that I actually felt dizzy, and I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself while Richard squeezed my shoulder in congratulation. But Dr. Hendricks wasn't finished speaking, and what she said next transformed my relief into something more complex. Furthermore, based on evidence provided by Ms. Rachel Anderson and investigated by the Atlanta Police Department, this board finds that there are serious questions about the care Lily received from her father in the hours and days leading up to her death. She continued, her voice taking on a harder edge. The security footage and witness statements suggest a pattern of neglect and possible abuse that directly contributed to this tragic outcome, and we will be cooperating fully with law enforcement's ongoing investigation into Marcus Anderson's conduct. She looked directly at me then, and I saw something like apology in her eyes. Ms. Morgan, on behalf of Peachtree Memorial Hospital, I want to formally apologize for the doubt cast upon your professionalism and the distress this investigation has caused you. Your administrative leave is lifted immediately, and you're welcome to return to work whenever you feel ready. Walking out of that hearing room felt like emerging from a cave into sunlight, and my mother was waiting for me with tears in her eyes and her arms open wide. I knew it. I knew they'd clear you, she said as she hugged me tightly, and I let myself cry against her shoulder the way I hadn't allowed myself to cry through this entire ordeal because I'd been too afraid that breaking down would be seen as an admission of guilt. Richard was making phone calls in rapid succession, informing various parties of the board's decision, and I could hear him saying things like complete exoneration and considering defamation suit that suggested Marcus's nightmare was just beginning while mine was finally ending. But even in that moment of victory, I couldn't fully celebrate because a little girl was still dead, and no matter whose fault it was or wasn't, Lily Anderson would never get to grow up and become whoever she was meant to be. The injustice of that weighed on me more heavily than Marcus's accusations ever had, because at least accusations could be fought and disproven, but death was final and irreversible. Detective Okafor called Richard's phone while we were still in the hospital parking lot, and Richard put him on speaker so I could hear the update. Mr. Chen, Miss Morgan, I wanted to inform you that we've completed our review of all available evidence in the Lily Anderson case, and we're moving forward with criminal charges against Marcus Anderson, the detective said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who'd built an airtight case. He's being charged with felony child endangerment, reckless endangerment resulting in death, and we're also investigating additional charges related to the abuse Rachel Anderson documented. The news that Marcus was being charged hit me with a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness because while I wanted justice for Lily and vindication for myself, I couldn't help but think about how this entire tragedy could have been prevented if someone had intervened sooner in that little girl's life. Detective Okafor continued explaining that they'd executed a search warrant on Marcus's apartment that morning and had found evidence that painted an even darker picture than anyone had imagined, including empty liquor bottles scattered throughout the home, Lily's bedroom in a state of neglect with barely any food in the apartment, and a journal that Lily had been keeping where she'd drawn pictures of herself crying and written things like, "Daddy is scary when he drinks," and "I wish Mommy could take me away." Hearing about that journal broke something inside me because it meant Lily had known she was in danger, had been crying out for help in the only way an 8-year-old knew how, and nobody had heard her in time. Richard asked Detective Okafor about the security footage and when it would be made available for public viewing, explaining that we needed it not just for the criminal case, but also because Marcus's accusations against me had spread so widely through social media and the community that my reputation needed the definitive proof those videos would provide. The footage will be presented at Marcus's arraignment tomorrow, and after that, it becomes part of the public record, Detective Okafor explained. I can tell you that what those cameras captured is damning beyond anything I've seen in years of working these cases. And when that footage goes public, there won't be a single person who questions what really happened that night." He paused and then added something that made my blood run cold. "Ms. Morgan, I want to prepare you for something. The footage shows Marcus sitting in his car in the hospital parking lot for an hour and 17 minutes with Lily clearly visible in the back seat. And from what we can see, she's not moving during most of that time. He's on his phone having what appears to be an argument, probably with Rachel based on the phone records, and he's drinking from a bottle while his daughter is dying in the back seat." The image Detective Okafor's words created was so horrific that I actually felt nauseous, and my mother must have seen something in my face because she took my arm and suggested we go somewhere to sit down and process everything that was happening. We ended up at a small cafe a few blocks from the hospital, one of those quiet places with exposed brick walls and soft jazz playing, where I'd sometimes come after difficult shifts to decompress. And sitting there with my mother across from me and a cup of tea I couldn't bring myself to drink, I finally started to really understand the magnitude of what had almost happened to me. If Mrs. Chen hadn't seen Marcus and Lily that afternoon, if Rachel hadn't kept meticulous records of Marcus's behavior, if Diana Torres hadn't been thorough enough to pull those phone records and push for the security footage, I could have been the one facing criminal charges right now while Marcus played the grieving father who'd lost his daughter to medical negligence. The system had very nearly failed both Lily and me, and it was only through a combination of determined investigation and, frankly, some good luck that the truth had come out before it was too late. My mother reached across the table and took my hand, and when I looked up at her, I saw tears in her eyes that mirrored my own. "Taylor, I need you to hear something and really understand it," she said with the fierce intensity that only mothers can summon when they're trying to impart crucial wisdom to their children. "What happened to Lily is not your fault. What Marcus did to his daughter is not your fault. The fact that the system failed to protect her before that night is not your fault. You did everything you could with the time and circumstances you were given, and you need to let go of any guilt you're carrying about not being able to save her." I knew intellectually that she was right, but emotionally, I was still struggling with the weight of Lily's death. Because when you're a nurse, and especially when you're a nurse who chose this profession because you lost your own sibling, every patient you lose takes a piece of you with them. Mom, I keep thinking about all the times I saw Lily in the hallway of our building, and I just smiled and said hi. And I wonder if there was something I should have noticed, some sign that she needed help, I confessed, through tears that wouldn't stop falling. "You can't carry that burden," my mother said firmly. "You weren't her doctor. You weren't her teacher. You were a neighbor who smiled at a child in passing, and unless you had concrete evidence of abuse, which you didn't, there was nothing more you could have done without overstepping every professional and personal boundary that exists." She was trying to absolve me of guilt I knew wasn't rational, but couldn't seem to shake, and I appreciated her effort even as I struggled to accept her words. We sat there for a long time, long enough that the lunch crowd came and went and the cafe started preparing for the afternoon rush, and gradually I began to feel like maybe I could actually move forward from this nightmare that had consumed the past 3 weeks of my life. Richard called later that afternoon to tell me that Marcus had been arrested at his apartment without incident and was being held without bail given the severity of the charges and the prosecutor's argument that he was a flight risk. "The arraignment is tomorrow morning at 9, and Taylor, I think you should be there," Richard said, his tone suggesting this wasn't just a suggestion, but something he felt was important for my healing process. "You need to see this through to the end. You need to look Marcus in the eye when the judge reads out those charges and know that justice is being served for what he did to Lily and what he tried to do to you." Part of me wanted to refuse because the idea of being in the same room as Marcus after everything he'd put me through filled me with anxiety. But another part of me, the part that had spent 3 weeks being accused and doubted and vilified, needed to see him face the consequences of his actions. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since the night Lily died. I allowed myself to really grieve for her as a person rather than as a patient or a symbol of my professional failure. I looked through the few photos I had on my phone from building events where Lily had been present, pictures from a Christmas party in the lobby where she was helping decorate cookies with that serious concentration children bring to creative tasks, a shot from a summer barbecue where she was playing with a neighbor's dog and laughing with pure joy. These images of Lily alive and happy were precious evidence that she'd had moments of childhood innocence despite whatever was happening in her home. And I cried for all the moments she'd never get to have, all the birthdays and graduations and first loves and adventures that had been stolen from her by a father who'd been too consumed by his own demons to protect the gift he'd been given. Sleep didn't come easily that night, despite my exhaustion, and I found myself lying awake thinking about the security footage that would be revealed tomorrow and what it would show about those final hours of Lily's life. Detective Okafor had said Marcus was on his phone arguing, probably with Rachel, while Lily was dying in the back seat. And I tried to imagine what could possess a parent to prioritize their own anger and pride over their child's survival. But I couldn't, because that level of selfishness was beyond my comprehension. I thought about Rachel, too, about the helplessness she must have felt being 4 hours away and knowing her daughter was in danger, but being unable to reach her, and I wondered if she'd spend the rest of her life tormented by what-ifs and if-onlys the way parents who lose children always seem to do. The next morning, I dressed carefully in clothing that was professional but not too formal, wanting to look like someone who deserved respect but not like someone seeking attention, and my mother insisted on coming with me to the courthouse for support. Richard met us outside the building, an imposing structure of gray stone and glass that embodied the weight of the legal system, and he briefed us quickly on what to expect. The arraignment itself will be relatively quick. The judge will read the charges, Marcus will enter a plea, which will almost certainly be not guilty at this stage, and then there will be arguments about bail, which the prosecution will oppose, he explained while we walked through security. The security footage will be shown as part of the prosecution's argument for why Marcus shouldn't be released, and Taylor, that's going to be very difficult to watch, so if you need to step out at any point, no one will judge you for it. We entered the courtroom, which was already filling with people, including several reporters who I recognized from local news stations, and I realized with a sinking feeling that this case had attracted media attention, which meant my name and face might be broadcast across Atlanta tonight. Richard must have seen my expression because he leaned over and whispered, "Don't worry. The narrative has completely shifted now. You're not the villain anymore. You're the dedicated nurse who did everything right while being falsely accused by the actual perpetrator." His words were meant to be comforting, but the idea of being any part of this media circus made me deeply uncomfortable because I'd never wanted attention. I'd only ever wanted to do my job and help people. When they brought Marcus into the courtroom, my breath caught because he looked nothing like the confident, angry man who'd attacked me in the hospital or spray-painted my car or spread lies about me online. He was handcuffed and wearing an orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on a frame that seemed to have shrunk since I'd last seen him. His hair was disheveled, his eyes were hollow and red-rimmed, and he moved with the shuffling gait of someone who'd been broken by the weight of their own actions. For just a moment, I felt a flicker of something that might have been pity, because regardless of what he'd done, he was still a human being who'd lost his daughter. But then I remembered Lily sitting alone and dying in the back seat of his car while he argued on the phone and drank, and that flicker of pity died before it could fully form. The judge, a stern-looking woman in her 60s, named Judge Catherine Morrison, who had a reputation for being tough but fair, entered the courtroom, and everyone rose until she took her seat and instructed us to sit. The proceedings began with formal declarations and the reading of Marcus's rights, and then the prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Amanda Wells, who specialized in crimes against children, stood to present the charges. "Your Honor, Marcus James Anderson is charged with felony child endangerment, resulting in death, reckless endangerment, child abuse, and obstruction of justice for his actions, leading to and following the death of his 8-year-old daughter, Lily Marie Anderson. She stated clearly, each word landing like a hammer blow in the silent courtroom. Marcus stood with his public defender, a tired-looking man who'd probably been assigned this case that morning, and when Judge Morrison asked how he pleaded, there was a long pause before he said in a voice so quiet I could barely hear it, "Not guilty, Your Honor." Amanda Wells then requested that bail be denied, arguing that Marcus posed a flight risk and potentially a danger to others, given his history of violence and substance abuse. Your Honor, the state has compelling video evidence that demonstrates the defendant's conscious disregard for his daughter's life, and we'd like to present a portion of that evidence now to support our motion to deny bail, she said, and Judge Morrison nodded her approval. The lights in the courtroom dimmed slightly as a large screen was lowered and a video player was set up, and Richard reached over to squeeze my hand in silent support as the footage began to play. The video was a compilation from multiple security cameras, and it started with timestamp reading 1:47 p.m., showing Marcus's car, a blue Honda sedan that I recognized from our building's parking garage, pulling into a spot at the far end of the hospital parking lot. The quality was surprisingly clear enough that you could see through the rear window of the car where a small figure was slumped in the back seat. And even from that distance and angle, it was obvious that something was terribly wrong with the child because of how still she was. The timestamp continued to roll while Marcus sat in the driver's seat, making no move to exit the car or check on his daughter. And after about 3 minutes of this footage, the video jumped forward to show Marcus at 2:15 p.m., still sitting in the same spot, now holding what appeared to be a bottle to his lips, while his phone was pressed to his ear. The courtroom was absolutely silent except for the sound of people shifting uncomfortably in their seats as they watched this horrific scene unfold, and I felt my mother's hand find mine and grip it tightly, because even though we'd known intellectually what this footage would show, seeing it was something else entirely. The video continued jumping forward in intervals, showing Marcus at 2:43 p.m., still in the car, at 3:08 p.m. getting out briefly to pace beside the vehicle before getting back in, at 3:31 p.m. appearing to be arguing animatedly with someone on the phone while gesturing wildly, with his free hand, and through all of this, the small figure in the back seat never moved. Finally, at 3:47 a.m., more than 2 hours after he'd first arrived at the hospital parking lot, the footage showed Marcus exiting his car, opening the back door, and attempting to lift Lily out, and the way her body hung limply in his arms made several people in the courtroom gasp audibly. The final piece of footage showed Marcus stumbling slightly as he carried Lily toward the emergency room entrance, and you could see him stop twice to set her down and adjust his grip, movements that suggested he was intoxicated and struggling with basic motor coordination. When the video ended and the lights came back up, the courtroom felt different somehow, heavier with the knowledge of what we'd all just witnessed, and I saw that even Judge Morrison's stern expression had shifted into something that looked like barely contained fury. Marcus was sitting with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking in what might have been sobs, and his public defender looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Amanda Wells let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking again. "Your Honor, what you've just seen is a father who had nearly 2 hours to get his critically ill daughter medical attention and instead chose to sit in a parking lot drinking and arguing on the phone while she died," she said, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. The medical examiner has confirmed that if Lily Anderson had received treatment when Marcus first arrived at that hospital, she would most likely be alive today. Instead, she died because her father's pride and intoxication were more important to him than her life, and this is why the state is requesting that he be held without bail. Judge Morrison's expression was colder than anything I'd witnessed in 17 years. "Mr. Anderson, What I've seen on that video footage is among the most egregious examples of parental neglect I've ever encountered. You had multiple opportunities to save your daughter's life and chose instead to indulge in alcohol while she suffered alone in your vehicle. Marcus tried to speak, but she silenced him. Bail is denied. You will remain in custody until trial. I hope every night in that cell you think about what you did and what you cost that little girl. As bailiffs escorted Marcus away, his eyes found mine across the courtroom. What I saw wasn't anger or defiance, but something like recognition. He was finally understanding the magnitude of what he'd done and what he'd tried to do to me by falsely accusing me of negligence. As they led him away in shackles, I felt tension I'd carried since he attacked me in the emergency room finally release. This was closure. Outside, media surrounded us with cameras and questions. Richard delivered our prepared statement. Ms. Taylor Morgan was falsely and maliciously accused by Marcus Anderson in a desperate attempt to deflect from his own criminal actions. She has been completely exonerated by both the hospital's investigation and the criminal investigation that revealed the true circumstances of Lily Anderson's death. I spotted Rachel Anderson at the crowd's edge. When our eyes met, she nodded, conveying everything words couldn't. We'd both been fighting for Lily, me trying to save her body in that ER, Rachel fighting through the legal system to save her memory from Marcus's lies. I walked over to her. "Thank you for fighting for the truth," Rachel said quietly. "Because you kept fighting, my daughter's real story got told." "I wish I could have saved her," I said. "I wish I'd gotten to her sooner. Wish I'd known what was happening in your home." Rachel hugged me and we stood holding each other while cameras flashed. "Lily talked about you sometimes," she told me. "She said you were always nice to her in the hallways and had a pretty smile. Those small kindnesses mattered to her when everything else was falling apart." The hospital issued a public apology. Dr. Hendricks acknowledged, "We failed Taylor Morgan by not investigating fully before placing her on leave, and we failed Lily Anderson by not asking harder questions about how a healthy child could deteriorate so rapidly. We're implementing new protocols for investigating allegations and additional training on recognizing child abuse." Returning to work was strange. Everyone knew my story. Sarah Mitchell apologized with tears. "I'm ashamed I doubted you even for a second. Fear and gossip clouded my judgment and I hurt you." The criminal case moved quickly. Marcus's lawyer tried negotiating a plea deal, but Rachel adamantly opposed any deal that would let him out of prison while she lived. He took my daughter's entire future. Every birthday, graduation, wedding she might have had. He can spend the rest of his life in prison thinking about what he did. At trial, I testified about Lily's condition and our treatment. The defense attorney tried suggesting ER mistakes, but I shut him down with facts. Emergency rooms are high pressure, but we have protocols specifically designed to prevent mistakes. In Lily's case, every single protocol was followed exactly as it should have been. The medical examiner testified that Lily died from prolonged oxygen deprivation, causing irreversible brain damage. If Lily had been brought to a hospital when symptoms first presented, around 1 p.m. based on testimony, her survival chances would have been approximately 85%. The security footage of Marcus sitting in his car while his daughter died incinerated any doubts the defense had planted. Rachel testified on day 4 about Marcus's deteriorating behavior, his drinking, her custody attempts, and the terrible phone call when Marcus refused to get Lily medical help despite her begging. He told me I was overreacting, that I was trying to take Lily away. He said he'd rather die than let me have her. Then he hung up and wouldn't answer. The defense tried painting Marcus as a grieving father who made mistakes under stress, calling a psychiatrist who testified about his depression and alcohol dependence. But prosecutor Amanda Wells destroyed this. Marcus Anderson chose to drink while his daughter was in distress, chose to sit in a parking lot for over 2 hours rather than walk 30 feet to an ER entrance. Those were all choices, weren't they? In closing arguments, Amanda Wells addressed the jury. Lily Anderson was 8 years old. She liked drawing and playing with dogs. She trusted her father to protect her. But Marcus Anderson chose alcohol over his daughter, anger over her life, pride over her survival. The security footage shows a man who had nearly 2 hours to save his daughter and chose not to. That's not an accident. That's a choice that demands accountability. The jury deliberated less than 4 hours. On the charge of felony child endangerment resulting in death, we find the defendant guilty. On reckless endangerment, guilty. On child abuse, guilty. With each verdict, weight lifted from my shoulders. Rachel and I cried openly. At sentencing, Judge Morrison was unsparing. You had countless opportunities to be the father Lily needed, to get help for your alcoholism, to simply walk 30 feet to an emergency room door. You failed at every opportunity. It is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to life in prison with possibility of parole after 30 years. Rachel and I went to Lily's grave, a small pink headstone reading, Lily Marie Anderson, beloved daughter, forever 8. I placed daisies there. I'm sorry I couldn't save you, Lily. I did everything I could. I hope you're safe and happy and free from pain now. Rachel put her arm around me. She would have liked you. If she'd had a chance to grow up, I think you two would have been friends. Life slowly returned to normal, though I was changed forever. The hospital promoted me to senior nurse and gave me a role developing protocols for identifying child abuse. I started volunteering with a children's advocacy center, turning my trauma into something that might protect future children. Rachel and I stayed in touch, meeting monthly. On what would have been Lily's 9th birthday, we planted a flowering cherry tree in a park near the hospital, a living memorial to a little girl who deserved so much more. A year after Lily's death, working a night shift, they brought in a 6-year-old boy with suspicious injuries. Something in the father's demeanor reminded me of Marcus. Instead of just treating and releasing, I called social services. It turned out the father had been abusing the boy for months. My intervention possibly saved that child's life. I made a renewed promise. I would never look away from abuse again, never let another child slip through my fingers. Marcus was in prison where he belonged. Rachel was rebuilding her life. Lily was at peace. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that little girl with the gap-toothed smile who used to wave at me in the hallway. I whisper into the darkness that I'm sorry I couldn't save her, but I promise I'll spend the rest of my career trying to save others like her. Maybe that's how we honor the ones we couldn't save, by fighting like hell for the ones we still can. I keep showing up for my shifts, keep fighting for my patients, believing one person really can make a difference. I carry Lily's memory as both a wound and a promise that I will never stop trying to be the kind of nurse who makes the world safer for children who deserve protection and love and the chance to grow up. That's Lily's legacy, and mine too now. Every time I save someone, every time I speak up for a child who can't speak for themselves, I think of Lily and hope that somewhere, somehow, she knows her death wasn't the end of her story, but the beginning of something that might save countless others.